Welcome to the Somerset Safeguarding Children Partnership Week. Like so much of this year, it's going to be a little bit different, and it's always slightly harder doing it on this rather than in person. As Karen said, I'm Superintendent Mike Pryor. I'm the Police Area Commander for Somerset, and I'm executive member of the SSCP. I have to get my acronyms right. There was a time, some time ago, and I quote, when the police are the only members of the public who are paid to give full-time attention to the duties which are incumbent on every citizen in community welfare. I was going to start that with a quiz, but actually that was said in 1829 when Sir Robert Peel set up the police. And I have to mention that, as we'll be hearing later on from Mark Peel, who I believe is a direct descendant of Sir Robert Peel. But how have times changed then since 1829? The welfare state, or indeed a state intent on the welfare of its citizens, has grown. So we've seen universal schooling, local authorities have become more developed. The foundation of the NHS, what was that, 77, 78 years ago? So things have changed quite a lot. And development and change is something that we all experience, doesn't it, within our roles. And the latest change came in the Wood Review and working together in 2018, which saw the tripartite arrangements shifting the responsibility solely from the Director of Children's Social Services to a shared and a joint responsibility across the local authority, the police and the CCG, the Clinical Commissioning Group, to do exactly as it says on the tin when it comes to working together, as in working together, to make sure that we share the same aims in looking after children. And luckily working together was slightly less prescriptive than the older rules, and it gave us a bit more flexibility to do that. And this is what this week's about. I was part of the old structure, and indeed for some time in Somerset we had the Somerset Children's Trust, and I think I chaired that uniquely twice. And the arrangements were quite complicated and probably not as effective as they could be. And I really welcome the changes which came via the Wood Review. However, we are in a complex partnership picture, and I was thinking about it this morning. It's a bit like three gearboxes, and they're all slightly different, and somehow we have to mesh them together, and the cogs are different sizes. And within that, it is a complicated situation. So we still have an adult safeguarding board, which I'm an executive member of, as is Val, which met on last Friday. We have a community safety structure, which is formerly known as the Crime and Disorder Reduction Partnership, which I also chair. We have a health and wellbeing structure, and all these bodies have sort of similar aims to look after the people we serve within Somerset. Also for the police, it's slightly different as well, because we operate over 4 other local authority areas, and of course Somerset is the only 2-tier local authority area within the force footprint, so it's slightly more complicated than that. What I would say is, though, Somerset is the most important. It's certainly the most important when it comes to residents. So it's 560,000 people live within Somerset, of which about 120,000 of those are children. And at my last count, I think there are about 28,000 people employed by the state to look after the welfare of those people. So that includes everyone from police officers, doctors, nurses, teachers, adult children's social care, dentists. There's a myriad of people who are out there who are aware of safeguarding, who do have a duty to look at it, and also a duty to inform when they see people who are in need and vulnerable. And I suppose that's our biggest challenge, isn't it, is how we see those people and how we make those referrals and how we come together to prevent someone from sliding further down a path where we know that path will take them into a very difficult, challenged life, and also will result in us having to probably put in quite a lot of remedial action, which wouldn't have been as effective as trying to prevent it in the first place. So it's a big challenge for us all. There's lots of people to do it. The question is, how do we work together? Which is the question that Wood asked, and we're hopefully trying to answer. I'm going to introduce Val now, as you say, Val Jansen. She's relatively new as Acting Director of Quality and Nursing for the CCG, but it's vastly experienced. And as I say, she joins me on the Adults Board as well as the Children's Structure. Val, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. Yeah, good morning, everyone. So I'm relatively new in the acting director post. I've been a deputy director for longer than I can remember, but only a deputy in Somerset for a year, so relatively new in Somerset as well. What I will say is that the arrangements around safeguarding children are different in different areas. So although the three strategic partners come together, the way the arrangements are organised can look differently. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the structures locally. And Caroline, I should have asked you this before today, but is there any way you could put up a structure chart of the arrangements, or not, or can that come up later? Maybe.
I will do my best while you're talking, Val.
All right, thank you. If you can't, don't worry. I'm sure it could be shared in the chat with people later. So as Mike said, it's this all came about in terms of the partnership work, and although it did exist in informal ways for since I can remember really working in the NHS, but certainly since the 2000s, and as well as with then the Children and Social Work Act came in 2017, formalising the duty for the three key partners to work together. And in Somerset, we've set up the executive group, and that comprises, as Mike says, of the health. So CCG represents health, children's social care, muddling up my safeguarding, children's social care, and the police. And the idea of the executive group is to exercise leadership and governance on behalf of the partnership. We ensure that they fulfil their statutory objectives as set out in the Children and Social Work Act 2017 and Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. So the new arrangements apply to the area defined by Somerset County Council local authority boundary. And membership of the executive group is obviously the three key partners. And the ethos of the group is to ensure the key partners are always represented at the various levels of the safeguarding structure. Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. So you can see that ultimately the responsibility lies at the top of the chart with the Chief Executive for the County Council, the Chief Constable for Avon and Somerset Constabulary, and the Chief Accountable Officer. And all three have delegated that responsibility to in the County Council's case, it's with the Director of Children's Services, and to Mike in terms of the police, and to the Director of Nursing in the CCG. And you can see just beneath that chart then is the Partnership Executive, which is what we're talking about now. And then you've got the business group on the right-hand side, and the Somerset Children's Partnership on the other side. Now, beneath the partnership group, you can see there are subgroups. And there's tiers 1, 2 and 3 of those subgroups. And really what we're aiming for is to have partnership from the three members at the very least in all of those subgroups, so that the work done throughout the structure is representative and taking forwards the three statutory partners' perspectives within that. So the executive group, we provide leadership for safeguarding children within the representing agency and sector. We have oversight and offer challenge to an agreed data set reflecting the safeguarding performance in Somerset, and we ensure that the allocated agency resources, financial and in kind, are utilised to meet our objectives. Does anybody have any questions so far? I can't see any hands up. Okay. I'll carry on. So I think Mike's already mentioned the Somerset Children's Trust, which is multi-agency, and this merged with the new Safeguarding Children arrangements about a year ago, with the new multi-agency partnership taking oversight of the Somerset Plan for Children and Young People, which is was set up in 2019 to 22. So we've got another year and a bit to go on that. And the partnership works with the relevant agencies who have safeguarding responsibilities under Section 11 of the Children's Act, as described in Working Together. I'm just going to move on a little bit now to stakeholder feedback. And the purpose of the feedback is to promote the voice of the child, to inform local safeguarding arrangements, which is essential in developing greater understanding of the perspectives of the children and young people by asking them for their views. So in Somerset, this is done in a number of ways. It's done in care and leaving care councils. There is a group called the Unstoppables. There's the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service Participation Group, which is run by Somerset Foundation Trust. And there's a youth forum, which have an annual conversation with executive leads, and they met recently in October. Mike, I don't know whether you want to come in with any feedback from that group, because I wasn't there for that. Is it worth talking a bit about that?
Yeah, so, one of the difficulties is making sure that we get a broad representation from people. And so we met that group, and it was a mixture of that group and some of the Somerset Youth Parliament, which was a very vibrant discussion, actually, very interesting and very truthful in terms of the comments made by the young people. What we've done in relation to that, certainly from the police side of things, is trying to improve our access so we can get a voice. And some of the young people on there said sometimes there's sort of a tokenism to that, and obviously we don't want that. We want a genuine conversation, because people's voices are, all worth the same, and that's part of the Wood Review report, isn't it? Everyone's, it has an equal say in it. So that's worked really well. I've taken that on to make sure we engage them with some of our other networks, where we look to hear the voice from the community. So that was good, and also that group has helped us with our planning in the past as well. And I know they've had a real impact, very high up with the sort of the chief exec and also the chairman of the council in terms of being involved from that. And as I say, the big proportion of children in Somerset, is massive. 120,000 plus or minus all the thousands of children which are at independent schools and boarding here. So it's a big input. And something we also always need to strive to make sure we're achieving, actually hearing what they're saying, because we all think we know what it's like to be a child, but for most of us that's quite a few generations away now, isn't it? So things change, and we need to be kept up to speed and on our toes by them.
Absolutely. I think I'll move on now to talk through the some of the scrutiny activities. I know that Mark is going to talk in detail about scrutiny after this section of the presentation. So scrutiny, supporting scrutinising the effectiveness of the arrangements is a key element of the partnership. And the point of this is to secure sufficient challenge and independence in the new relationship, in the new partnership arrangements, because you'll probably all remember that there used to be an independent chair for children's safeguarding boards, and we no longer have that in the new arrangements, or a requirement for that. So we do have a requirement for scrutiny. So the lived experience of children and young people in the multi-agency context is at the centre of all scrutiny activity in Somerset, and I'll just describe a couple of examples of that. So we've got an agency, a forum called the Partnership Forum, which has a focus on theme learning, and as the priorities and areas of development arise across the partnership, the forum is one of a range of methods for relevant agencies to engage, and it is a relatively new group, and the purpose of it is to hold themed events to strengthen the partnership and disseminate learning across the agencies and sector, and to promote the voice of the child, to inform our arrangements. And another area is that we have community lay members in place and co-opted, who have a distinct role to play in the partnership forum as the independent scrutineers. Is there anything else, Mike, you wanted to add?
I suppose it's how it feels, and it's back to that sort of gearbox analogy that our organisations are different sizes and spread over a sort of different responsibility. So that the police is relatively small within its footprint and within Somerset, but has a lot of its sort of boiler room, engine room outside of Somerset at our headquarters, and it's the same for the CCG, which is a really large employer for Somerset, a budget of £850 million pounds. And then the county council again is like that, large employer, lots of responsibilities across a diverse number of fields, from adults to children to highways all the way across. And it's how those mash together. And I think the new arrangements about the making it equal, I think that's helped a lot. And I feel that my voice is heard. And also I have a better understanding of other organisations' needs. And when it comes down to partnership working, it's a thing of altruism, really, isn't it? You have to help another partner achieve their aim, even if that makes it look a bit harder for you. You have to realise that their aim may be more important. And then the other thing that I truly learnt during this year is partnership working. To me, is all about fixing the roof when it's not raining. And obviously this year it's been particularly challenging for us. And I'm not sure if we're going to talk specifically around COVID. I think on Friday I'm talking about that. But in terms of having these relationships for when things get difficult, if you've got friendly professional relationships in the best of times, when things are difficult and you're challenged, those friendly professional relationships are absolutely worth their weight in gold in terms of getting stuff done and putting oil into the gearbox. Is really important, and I see that within Somerset. I see that working relationship, that desire by all those people, those 28,000 people, to safeguard children and adults, protect the vulnerable, and prevent people from having bad times. And I think that works really well.
I just want to talk briefly about some of our audit arrangements so that you get a flavour of some of the things that we are doing in order to seek assurance around safeguarding. And then I'll hand over to Mark. So we do something called a Section 11 audit, and this is carried out on a regional basis. We are in a region across Baines, Bristol, North Somerset, South Gloss, which means that we have a bigger pool of resource, basically, to carry out these audits, and a pool of reviewers who have an understanding across all the different arrangements, which is very helpful. And the 2020 audit which is currently underway, includes looking at multi-agency safeguarding arrangements, thresholds and continuum of need, engaging with children and young people, and training and workforce development. And so the partnership will make use of the Section 11 findings to inform themes for future forum events. And then, of course, we do the multi-agency case audits and so on, which I expect a number of you are already involved with those. So I will stop there and hand over to Mark. Thank you very much for attention. It's very strange doing this in this way, isn't it? Because I can't gauge from my audience how helpful this information is. But I'm going to say bye for now, and thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Peel. I'm the Independent Scrutineer for the Safeguarding Partnership in Somerset. I have a presentation that I'm going to make to you, but I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to do a couple of other things. Firstly, it's to thank you all for finding some time this morning to be part of this forum. It's really interesting, isn't it, to hear Mike talk about the fact that there are 28,000 people around a county like Somerset who have a direct responsibility for safeguarding. I don't think we've got 28,000 people as part of this forum meeting this morning. So you actually are really important in hopefully cascading some of the information that we give you this morning to other people that you work with, so that information about safeguarding in Somerset can leach out and get out to all of the people who actually have the front line, most important roles in terms of safeguarding children and young people across the country. So again, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate that. I'd echo something that Val just said. This is a really strange way of making a presentation. It's not what we'd intended when we started to talk about this forum. But, as you're very well aware, other matters have intervened, and this is better than not doing a forum. So I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about a number of things, but I'd really welcome questions. Please don't feel you have to wait till I've stopped speaking to ask the questions, because as you get to hear a bit more from me, you'll know how much I love the sound of my own voice. So please, for the sake of everyone, actually interrupt me where you can. I particularly like it if you're not happy with what I'm saying and you don't understand what I'm getting at. Any challenge, very, very welcome. This is a great opportunity to hear different perspectives from around the safeguarding world. Before I start the presentation, Mike was also right to say, yes, I am a direct descendant of the Prime Minister who founded the police force. And you might think that must be hugely to my advantage if I ever got into trouble with the police, a bit like a sort of get out of jail free card. And sadly, my experience has been that hasn't proved to be the case. And I'll just give you one example. It's a long time ago now, but a girlfriend of the time, back in the day, was protesting at Greenham Common. Those of you of a certain age will remember that protest about cruise missiles and Americans basing them in the UK. I was working as a social worker somewhere reasonably nearby to Greenham, and my concern about my girlfriend was that she wouldn't be eating properly. Nothing political or philosophical. I was worried that she wouldn't be eating properly. So I decided one evening to drive over to Greenham, and on my way to pick up a few boxes of pizza, which I would give to my girlfriend at the time and to her friends who were protesting there. I arrived, got out of my car with about 4 or 5 pizza boxes in my hand, and was in the process of giving them to my girlfriend when out of the bushes, and literally out of the bushes, a number of police officers popped up and arrested me because they weren't quite sure what was going on, and they weren't ready to believe immediately that what was going on was a delivery of pizza. They thought it was something rather more nefarious than that. Now, I did tell them about my relationship with the founder of the police force, but strangely it didn't seem to go down too well, and certainly didn't get me out of trouble with my boss, who they woke up later on that night just to make sure I was who I was. So it's interesting that Mike knows about that. It's not something, by and large, that most people do. It hasn't done me any favours over the years, but it is true to say that the Pelian principles that are the baseline for how we're policed as a country are worth looking at, because it is policing of the people by the people. It's a very interesting take, and it's a historic take now on a real partnership around law and order, and it has some congruence, I think, with how we work together as safeguarding professionals. Now, I've been independent scrutineer in Somerset since January this year, so it's fair to say it's been an odd year to take up that responsibility. I'm pleased that I had a couple of months before the initial lockdown to meet people and to come to meetings in Somerset. But of course, subsequent to March this year, all bets are off and all things have changed. And it isn't an apology, but certainly after nearly a year of being in role, I'm not quite at the place that ideally I would have liked if the pandemic had not intervened to make it more difficult for me to be directly involved. So I am sorry that I've not met as many people, perhaps including some of the people who are at this forum today over the course of the last few months, that I would have made time and space to meet or at least talk to bump into in other circumstances had times been more normal. We're all hoping, aren't we, that maybe 2021 will be a better year in terms of getting back to whatever new normal looks like. I think the promise that I'll give you here and now is when it's possible for me to be more directly and personally engaged with someone, that is something I'm very much looking forward to. It's interesting. I think we've all got used to using Microsoft Teams as a mechanism for communication, and certainly it's better than not having this mechanism. But we're all also now at a stage where we recognise, I think, what of this sort of interaction are, and you miss all the body language and other sort of human parts of interacting, the sort of discussions that happen in the corridors and before and after meetings, the sort of sense of humour that sometimes comes through in meetings, feel a little more filtered sometimes Microsoft Teams. So it's great that we're doing it, and I see from the evidence from Somerset that I keep an eye on how well it's being used by you as safeguarding professionals. And again, I thank you for that. Thank you for sticking with it. It was our concern right at the outset of the pandemic that the problems of working from home, the problems of communication, the problems of keeping the oil in a gearbox, using Mike's analogy, would be insurmountable under the auspice of the pandemic, and that consequently children and young people in Somerset would suffer in a way that had hitherto not been the case. Certainly, what there is evidence of in Somerset, as I've talked about in part of my contribution to the Safeguarding Annual Report, is hugely creative mechanisms to keep the safeguarding bus en route, so to speak, that have come largely from frontline professionals who are looking for ways to ensure that the children and people they do care for don't miss out. That's not just true in Somerset, it is true across the country, but nonetheless it's an absolutely astonishing achievement, and it's something that should be recognised, and I do talk about it in my part of the annual report. That's enough of an introduction, I think. I'm going to move on to talk about a number of things, but really the purpose of my presentation this morning is to give you information so that you have a better understanding of how safeguarding works in Somerset, to be able to put that into the context of the changes that happened in safeguarding just over a year ago, so that you can answer the question, you can address the question, what's changed, what's the same, what's different in Somerset now, and how does that work? What are the advantages for us as professionals and for children and young people in Somerset? I'm advised by Caroline in preparation for today's presentation that many of you will be really experienced safeguarding professionals, but there also will be people joining us today at the forum who don't have the benefit of such a comprehensive experience in safeguarding. So I need to pitch this in a way that helps people who don't have detailed knowledge of safeguarding to understand what's going on, but I also don't wish to be patronising to those people who've got form in this area, who've been around the block a little bit. So you may have to bear with me at certain stages of this if what I'm talking about is already well known to you, or is something you're hearing for the first time. Just before I get going with that, it's difficult for
I think we've lost Mark, sadly. I know he's
talk in the first instance about the role, my role as independent scrutineer, and you heard Val. I heard Val just a few minutes ago talk about the fact that you must be aware that under for safeguarding there were local safeguarding children boards which were chaired by independent chairs. I was previously an independent chair in Leeds, City of Leeds, and also in the London Borough of Lambeth. And in September 2019, the law changed, and new arrangements came into force at that point, which were brought about by a review conducted by somebody called Alan Wood. That was a sort of evaluation of where boards were at, and was the catalyst for changes in the law that both Val and Mike referred to, that have resulted in the board being brought to conclusion and a new safeguarding partnership set up. And one of the things that has come as a result of those changes that came into effect in September last year was the replacement of independent chairs of local safeguarding children boards with something called independent scrutiny. Now, it's fair to say that the sort of Bible, the government guidance, which is called Working Together, which tells local authorities, tells partnership, what their responsibilities are in relation to safeguarding, is less than fully detailed about what independent scrutiny actually is. It mentions it, but it doesn't put a duty on local authorities to have a person, an individual, as an independent scrutineer. It's an awful job title, by the way. I think it's a made-up word, but that's what we've got. It doesn't put a responsibility, a statutory responsibility on an authority or partnership to employ an individual as a scrutineer, and it gives a degree of flexibility about how that independent scrutiny can be brought in. So, for example, some authorities, rather than having an individual as a scrutineer, have used that flexibility as a mechanism to buy in scrutiny from a range of different people to look at a range of different things. A bit like you might buy in expert help for an audit, okay? You would buy in somebody who has particular proficiency in that particular area. They do that audit for you. They would give you the work. That would be the independent scrutiny. Most partnerships, however, have stuck with the idea of having an individual, an independent scrutineer to take the work forward, and that's the case. In where I mentioned to you just a moment or two ago, I was the independent chair. I morphed, from one day to another, from the independent chair into the independent scrutineer. And let's go back to the original question I posed there. So what, really? What's changed as a result of that? Why change the title if the role is exactly the same? Okay. The role is actually very different between being independent chair and independent scrutineer, and it's worth taking just a minute to tease apart what the differences are. Now, LSCB, the precursor to the partnerships we've got now, have been around for just over 10 years, and one of the founding principles of LSCB was that they were headed up by independent people, like people who did not work for the authority in which the board was based, people who were well informed, had some degree of expertise in terms of safeguarding, and somebody who could hold the authority through the board to account. Now, in terms of the managerial arrangements for independent chairs, that sort of people who became independent chairs were people like retired senior police officers, were people like retired DCS, the Director of Children's Services, were people perhaps like me, although I'm in the minority here, who have a background in academia, but also have professional qualifications. In a sense, and I don't wish this to sound arrogant, it's a reflection of what I saw. It was the sort of great and the good being recruited in as independent chairs to take an impartial view of what was going on in an authority, and when necessary to hold that authority to account. And perhaps it's just worth reminding ourselves that 10 years ago, the government view of authorities, particularly around safeguarding, was not very positive. There was a view that authorities were not fulfilling their statutory obligations. You may well have a different view on that, but I'm telling you what I saw in government at that point. And consequently, I think, and this is my opinion here, one of the reasons for independent chairs was, in a sense, a degree of distrust that arrangements within authorities were sufficient, were robust enough, were transparent enough to actually learn from safeguarding problems and communicate those problems transparently up to government and other agencies. So in a sense, independent chairs were a little bit of a big stick brought in by government on the previous legislation to ginger up the safeguarding geography and to hold to account the boards that had been set up. Things have greatly changed over the course of the 10 years. And certainly the government view at the point that Alan Wood was commissioned to take forward the review that resulted in the changes that came into effect in September last year was that LSCBs have not been as proficient, as successful as initially been hoped by the government in turning around safeguarding. Now, you've got to remember that governments of whatever complexion have a responsibility for safeguarding, but don't have the detailed knowledge and day-to-day experience that we have. And the rather naive view that I think characterised government perspective at that point was, after 10 years of LSCBs, after 10 years of serious case reviews where we try and learn the lessons from when things go badly wrong in safeguarding, how come we're not in a much better position than we are currently? Because the government perspective, particularly on serious case reviews, were that they tended to repeat the same message, find the same discrepancies over and over again, but that didn't seem to be having a profound effect on influencing and improving practice, and consequently decreasing the number of children and young people who were in the circumstances that serious case reviews tended to talk about. It's quite a naive view, it's quite a mechanical view, but nonetheless, I think that is, or at least was, prior to September 2019, the view taken by government. LSCBs have had their opportunity. Great expectations have been levelled upon that. No real definitive improvement from a government perspective seemed to be coming forward. So they commissioned Alan Wood to have a look and come up with suggestions for how things might improve. And that's how the new partnership that Mike talked about, which brings together inequality, police, health, and children's services, local authority usually, but children's services, delegated responsibility, in an equal partnership to progress safeguarding at on a local basis, on a partnership basis. You might ask, where's education and where are other very important agencies in that relationship? And those are good questions, but they're the three agencies that Alan felt were pivotal, were key to improving safeguarding. He also wanted to change the focus, and I think this is a very welcome change, to be perfectly honest with you. He wanted to change the focus of safeguarding away from a sort of blame culture, pointing the finger at agencies or individuals when they had got things in very complex circumstances wrong, and change that, the sort of serious case review blame culture, to a culture which focuses more on learning, on making sure that where things do go wrong, and in any human complex system like safeguarding, things will go wrong, but making sure we learn the lessons from that, and that the whole approach of the partnership is not around blame setting or personal or agency responsibility. It's around improving the safeguarding practice on a day-to-day basis, and of course at a managerial level, and getting learning into practice as quickly as possible. Because one of the key criticisms of serious case reviews is they took too long. And by the time that serious case reviews were published, things had moved on to such an extent that the findings perhaps weren't as relevant as they would have been if they'd come to the market, if they'd come to the safeguarding market more quickly. So what Alan put together is quite a revolutionary view of safeguarding. And whilst it's fair to say that the acronyms haven't changed that much, we've changed from LSCBs to LSCPs. So if you didn't think about this too much, it could look very similar. But the working relationships and the objectives of the new partnerships have changed fundamentally. It brings together police, health, and children's services in an equal partnership, whereas previously children's services, a bit like cabinet government, were sort of first amongst equals, prims inter pares, and really had the casting vote on what was and what was not safeguarding. That's changed fundamentally subsequent to September last year, when now the views and experiences of our colleagues from health and the police are equally important and need to be sought and respected in each circumstance. Moreover, Mike referred to it, But the new arrangements under working together give safeguarding partnerships a degree of flexibility that the previous arrangement did not offer. So, for example, our the safeguarding executive is made up of those three safeguarding partners, have a responsibility, but also have freedom to determine local safeguarding priorities on whatever basis they want. They can do that annually or 6 monthly or whatever. Because another one of the criticisms of the previous LSCBs was that responsibilities had, over the 10 years of their existence, continually been added to the LSCB portfolio, and none had ever been taken back, to the extent that LSCBs were drowning in responsibilities, to the extent that they couldn't make any real progress with any specific issues that were of particular local concern. The new arrangements give our exec, the three agencies, an opportunity to set the priorities for the locality. And we heard Mike and Val talk about talking to young people, listening to their lived experience and voices, and that being a critical key factor in formulating the priorities for Somerset, but also in reflecting a health view, a police view, and a children's services view, which jointly comes together so that our priorities are genuinely shared, genuinely partner priorities. So it's quite a revolutionary backdrop, and that's where independent scrutiny comes in. That's the history behind it. In terms of the status, if you like, comparison between independent chairs and independent scrutiny, again, that's quite interesting, I think. You need to understand the difference between where we were under boards, where we are under partnerships. Previously, as I said, it was usual suspects like me who were recruited as independent chairs, and our working relationship would often be with the chief exec. So in Leeds, that was the case. I worked to the chief exec, and similarly in Lambeth, I worked to the chief exec. Now, the orientation there, I think, under the board, remember my point about chairs being brought in as a sort of big stick for authorities, was that if I was supervised by the chief exec, I could sit with the sort of big beasts of safeguarding, director of children's services, chief constable, director of nursing, as a colleague, on an equal footing, and that consequently my view would be accepted around the table by those people. Actually, I've never found a difficulty with that. It's interesting in safeguarding. People are keen to hear independent perspectives and do not need, from my experience, that sort of artificial, mechanistic way of thinking. But that's certainly changed subsequent to the new legislation, because as an independent scrutineer in Somerset, I now work to the exec. I don't work to the chief exec. So the relationship is a slightly different one to the relationship between peers that independent chairs used to have when sitting on an exec, usually chairing the meeting, to the relationship that independent scrutineers across the country now have with their execs, where really the execs are selecting the priorities, they're setting the strategic tone for safeguarding in their areas, and one of the people that they give responsibility to check on that and come back to them with data and with view would be myself as independent scrutineer, but would also be the safeguarding business unit, which is headed up by Caroline Dowson. So that looks like that most partnerships have appointed individual independent scrutineers rather than going with a sort of hybrid version that I talked about earlier on. I think part of that is because it's what they know. It's the typical, it's the characteristic relationship that they've had hitherto, and it's I don't mean comfortable in a pejorative sense, but they feel that having a relationship with a person is a real relationship that they can develop over time. And most partnerships like Somerset have stuck with that. But interestingly, the number of days that independent scrutineers offer across the country, across England and Wales, to their respective partnerships is, on average, considerably less than the number of independents to their board. And that, I think, also tells the story of a different relationship. In Somerset, my relationship with the partnership is only 15 days a year. There would be circumstances where that would need to be increased, but that's a considerably lesser number of days than the previous independent chair had in Somerset. Probably the most important point for you to take on board in respect to independent scrutiny is independent scrutiny actually independent inspection? Now, I don't think there's not a definitive view here, and certainly working together doesn't tell us much about independent scrutiny other than you should have some, whatever that is. I'm going to take the view in Somerset, and I talked about this when I was interviewed for the role, so I can only assume that the execs thought it was a reasonably good idea, that the three partners, health, police, and children's services, are already very thoroughly inspected. And one of the things that the Wood Review left alone was the three distinct inspectoral bodies, because there was some talk about bringing those three bodies together with joint and several responsibilities for safeguarding, but replacing Ofsted, CQC, HMIP with one body that took an overview of those three different agencies. For reasons I'm not going to elaborate on here because there isn't time, that didn't happen, and three distinct inspectoral bodies were left in place. So my view is that the last thing senior police officers, junior police officers, senior social workers, first line newly recruited social workers, directors of nursing, and your newest nursing recruit need is yet another tier of inspection, yet another sort of finger wagging, you should do better approach. So I've taken the view that independent scrutiny is not another tier of inspection. And here, I'd be really interested if anyone around the table today thinks I've simply got that wrong or doesn't agree with what I'm going to go on to say. Here's your opportunity to tell me that I'm wrong. Why isn't it independent inspection? Well, as I said, I think you're inspected enough. And I think there are really specific elements that independent scrutiny should be about. As I said a couple of minutes ago, one of them is to help the executive to select priorities for Somerset, which are the right priorities, and perhaps also in the fullness of time to help the executive understand that you can't keep priorities permanently. There's got to be some churn, some turnover of priorities, because if you just keep adding more and more priorities, firstly, I think we'll repeat the problem that occurred with SSCP that I've just talked about. And also, you compromise. Every time you add a priority, you compromise on the amount of time, space, and attention you can give to what you are taking forward as priorities. So, firstly, it's to help exec select the priorities. Secondly, it's to help them understand that they can't be priorities forever. Thirdly, it's to make sure that they are using whatever means they can amongst their agencies, amongst their local elected members, amongst children and young people's groups, to ensure that they are the right priorities at the right time for Somerset. So that's the first level, and that's obviously very different to inspection. I also think, and here I'll link back to the point I made about the fact that under the pandemic, my hands have been tied as to what I would have done in ordinary circumstances. The critical role for independent scrutiny is to make relationships, is to talk to people, is to listen particularly to people. And despite evidence to the contrary, this morning I can listen as well as talk. Particularly young people. I would have liked to have been much more enmeshed and integrated with the existing groups for young people in Somerset than it's been possible for me to be under present circumstances, and that's something I'd like to put right in the course of the next year if I possibly can. And again, that's very difficult, very different, I beg your pardon, to independent inspection. It's also, I think, a linkage between your independent scrutineer, myself, and the existing business unit. You're lucky in Somerset to have a very well established and very well led business unit, and clearly what you don't want is an independent inspector going off at a tangent and not having a close communicative relationship, a partnership relationship really with the business unit who are around 5 days a week, 52 weeks of the year, whereas I'm only around 15 days a year. So again, that's a very different relationship to one of independent inspection. And lastly, let's talk about independent challenge, because that's something that is the same between independent chairs as well as an independent scrutineers as is. Because an awful lot of nonsense, frankly, is talked about independent challenge from my perspective. There are circumstances where independent challenge is absolutely the right thing to do. But in a sense, it's like the nuclear option. You would, as an independent scrutineer or an independent chair, I think you would only take formal independent challenge if things were intractable, if discussions hadn't resolved things, if having raised them with, your exec or with senior officers, there didn't seem to be much interest in putting things right. If you felt that there was a culture within an organisation of covering things up and lack of transparency, if you felt things were fundamentally and potentially criminally wrong, those would be the circumstances where you would press the nuclear button and make an independent challenge. And like all independent scrutineers and ex-independent chairs, if the circumstance absolutely required it, I have no problem with going down that route at all. But it's the very, very last thing I want to do, because I think if you do press that nuclear button, your relationships as an independent chair or now as an independent scrutineer with all of the agencies who are represented across a partnership are going to be indelibly marked by that. Any good relationships and good communication that you've built up will likely be eroded by that, because trust is a fundamental part of all of this. Just as working in a team, you need to trust the practitioners who work side by side with you. Working in a partnership and across agencies requires, as Mike very shrewdly said, those human relationships, those good working relationships to be happening. So I see independent challenge as quite a nuanced thing. There will be circumstances where I would perhaps inform our exec of different things that I'm aware of happening in different partnerships, so that they can make an informed judgment about whether or not to take that approach themselves. If there were concerns, perhaps coming from reviews or from complaints that I felt required a quiet word in the ear of an individual person at senior level, of course I would do that. Might require me to raise something with the executive, of course I would do that. The orientation here being to put matters right and to maintain positive relationships, not hide things away, not put things undercover, not be less than transparent, but to deal with them in a professional, collegiate way with professionals. So independent challenge starts way over here in terms of, do you think you might need to think about that again? And comes way over here in terms of pressing the nuclear button if things are so intractably wrong that only bringing in the cavalry is going to put things right. I suppose I've been involved in safeguarding now for about a decade in this sort of role, and luckily I've never had to be in a position to go to the extreme, to press the nuclear button. It's extraordinary what can be achieved with goodwill, with good people, and with good communication. And I have never, again, possibly luckily, I've never met anybody at senior level whilst I've been a safeguarding senior officer who doesn't have the best interests of children and young young people and wanting to do the best for them at the centre of their minds. Sometimes some of the agency politics gets in the way, but it's a good starting point. Good people tend to work in this area, and if encouraged, good people get to be good practitioners and good managers. So I see independent challenge as supportive, as informative, as discursive, and if and only if absolutely necessary, that challenge turning over into something more formal. And that's the role that I've taken in Somerset. I'm going to move on from talking about independent scrutiny, because you've probably heard enough about it, to talk a little bit now about the new format for the replacement for rapid reviews, the replacement for the national panel, so that you can have a better understanding of that. And again, I'll just remind you here, I've had to pitch this at a level that is okay for people relatively new to this area, but also respects the fact that many of you are very experienced officers. So let's move on to serious case reviews. Again, I'll put some historic meat on the bone here. You've already heard me say that there was, at the time Alan Wood did his review, and that came into changes of legislation in September last year, concern at government level and at other levels too, that serious case reviews, which were commissioned when things had gone wrong in safeguarding. So let me give you an example from Leeds, where I was independent chair. I looked after a young man in the company of his care worker, living in a residential children's home. Got out of the children's home, they bought fish and chips from a local takeaway, and they'd sat in a local park eating their fish and chips under a tree. After they'd finished eating their meal, the young man, climbed the tree. Unknown to the care worker who was with him, there was a rope, a ligature in the tree, and tragically this young man died as a result of hanging himself from the tree. So this is a hugely complex circumstance. It's a looked after child in the company of a residential care worker at the point of his death. When we looked at his care plan, it turned out that there were recommendations there that he had a history of high places and climbing and shouldn't be allowed to climb. He had climbed a tree, and that's where he had died. And again, the key worker was involved in that, should have been involved in that care plan. So we commissioned a serious case review to look at that. And that's the sort of circumstance. They'll all vary. They'll all be equally tragic, usually with a young person very seriously hurt or even worse, having died at the heart of them. Serious case reviews were commissioned by LSCBs. We employed independent authors and independent chairs to take the review forward, and they drew together information from all of the agencies involved to come up with a composite story of what happened and why it had happened, but also make recommendations for the future about how to learn from this and how perhaps to avoid similar circumstances in future. Sounds great, doesn't it? One of the problems was that the time it took for serious case reviews to go from commissioning to completion was often very significant. Matters judicial tended to intervene and meant that for reasons of not prejudicing justice, maybe people weren't available to speak to the review for very protracted periods of time, which further lengthened the period of time that the review took. From a critical perspective, serious case reviews tended to be really, really heavy on descriptive chronology, what happened, how many phone calls were made, who did what, and where, and relatively light on, now we know all this stuff, what recommendations and learning can we make. And one of the principal difficulties of the fact that they took such a long time is by the time the recommendations came into the public domain, because SCRs had to be published, they had to be transparent, the recommendations were largely out of date. From my perspective, serious case reviews tended to be quite worthy documents serious case reviews tended to be quite worthy documents, and they were more akin. I do have a background as an academic. They looked more like PhD theses than sort of reports and working documents that would make sense to be easily accessible to professionals at the front line of safeguarding. And the longest one that I ever read ran to just over 360 pages and something like 250,000 words, which was substantially longer than my PhD thesis. So I think the analogy does bear some comparison. Certainly the idea that social workers, nurses, police officers, teachers were going to read these enormous, sometimes, documents, I think was naive. So serious case reviews are seen to have potential problems and be extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily time-consuming, and not actually deliver very much. Moreover, as I said in the introduction, that the recommendations that one serious case review as opposed to another tended to come up with were very similar. So government, as you can quite easily imagine, were gnashing their teeth a little bit about the fact, well, how come we know all this and we don't seem to be putting that information into practice? We don't seem to be learning the lessons of serious case review. So the Wood Review has done away with serious case reviews altogether and replaced it with a streamlined and much more timely system based on rapid reviews in the first instance, and then, and only if there are perhaps exceptional or very complex circumstances, subsequent reviews which will look at matters in more detail. I'll talk a bit more about that in a few minutes, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to drone on too much about it, because it's rapid reviews that I want to just focus on for a couple of minutes here. Now, the mechanism for rapid reviews is very straightforward and is similar to what we had previously. When an event occurs within a partnership that has a serious safeguarding implication, the Director of Children's Services is usually the DCS or somebody delegated by the DCS, has a responsibility to notify Ofsted, the inspectoral body for children's services, and the national panel. I'll come on to them in a few minutes. That something has happened in the partnership triggering the need to make this notification, and as a result of that notification, the need to conduct a rapid review. Well, let's just talk about the time frame for a rapid review. Once that notification has been made, that's the first day, if you like, of the rapid review. Rapid reviews have to be turned around in 15 working days, so 3 weeks if you want to think about it that way, with a full review of what has happened, along with recommendations. That has to be completed within 15 working days, and that has to, two things have to happen. It has to then be sent to the national panel and to Ofsted once it's completed so that they can have a look at it, but it also has to be, there are some exceptions to this, but it has to be in the public domain, so there's a degree of transparency here. Now, some of you may have heard me talk before about rapid reviews, and if I repeat myself, my apologies, but this is a different group. When I heard about rapid reviews, my initial worry was that it would not be possible in only 15 days to complete a review of always complex circumstances. They're never simple or easy. That would be anything but of quite low quality. With only 15 days in a complex situation, under pressure to get it done, turned around and submitted, that the quality of rapid reviews would be almost essentially poor. My concern was that if the quality of that initial rapid review was poor, the decision-making and response coming off the back of that rapid review would also be less than fully informed, less than perfect, and not as good, not as high quality as it might otherwise have been if we had had more time to complete the rapid review. Well, I'm really pleased to tell you that I was absolutely and categorically wrong in my concerns about rapid review. I've done a piece of research over the course of the last few months where I've looked at 100 rapid reviews because I had these concerns. And whilst it's fair to say that there is difference between rapid reviews done by one partnership as compared to another, the quality of rapid reviews completed in only 15 days is astonishing. Not what I'd expected at all. Moreover, it's more than a year since September 2019, but there were some early adopter partnerships, so a slightly bigger time frame than you might think. The quality of rapid reviews since their introduction has progressively, and across all boards, across all partnerships, improved dramatically. So not only are they good, they're getting better. So my concerns that the quality of assessment possible in only 15 days would be poor were completely wrong. I obviously don't know what it was talking about in that regard. What rapid reviews consequently give us is a mechanism by which concerns like the concern I talked to you about around the young man who hung himself in a tree in Leeds can be looked at quite quickly across the partnership in only 15 days in reasonably high quality with clear recommendations that have a focus on practice, a focus on learning, and are not oriented around who dropped the ball, who made the mistake, who's to blame here. Because I think in the past, taking that rather adversarial approach to reviews has meant, quite understandably, humanly, people are wary about what they say in reviews. Because who wants to be the person who made the fatal mistake? It makes you cagey. That sort of approach makes you cagey about what you're willing to share with the reviews. So the rapid review seems to be treading a path which is much more based on practice and on improvements to practice. Moreover, if it can be completed in 15 working days, and let's be generous and say it takes a couple of months to start to permeate out into a partnership, well, it's likely that the professionals who are involved at the point that the incident happened are still in their posts. They've not moved on to other jobs, been promoted or retired. That's got to be a good thing. And the focus on learning and the partnership approach that's engendered by our new exec means that what we have an opportunity to do is to get learning into practice much earlier than we would have done under a serious case review. Let me leave you with this as far as serious case reviews are concerned. The average length of time it took to bring a serious case review from commissioning to publication was a little short of 3 years. And we're replacing that with something, it may not be as detailed, as heavy on chronology as the serious case reviews were, but it's focused on practice, it's focused on young people, it's focused on their circumstances, and it's focused on getting that learning cascaded back into practice through the business unit, through the executive, through your agencies, as quickly as we possibly can. So I'm really pleased to be wrong about rapid reviews, and I think what they do offer us as safeguarding professionals is a degree of assurance that we're not constantly 2 or 3 steps behind the ball. We're on top of things. This new mechanism is working very well, and it's well supported now by the new National Child Safeguarding Panel down in London. Because I mentioned earlier that once a critical incident is noted, notification needs to go to Ofsted and this new national panel down in London, and that when the rapid review is completed, the text of the rapid review goes to the national panel for consideration. And the national panel is the new national panel is a much larger body than its predecessor, which was actually only about 4 people. There are also people who are a bit closer to safeguarding on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, it's chaired by a woman called Karen Manners, who's I think recently retired, very senior police officer from Thames Valley. These are people who know what they're talking about as far as safeguarding is concerned. And more importantly than any of that, my experience as an independent chair previously and now as an independent scrutineer is leading me to believe that a different type of relationship is being developed between the national panel and partnerships like Somerset. In the past, the relationship was very much the adversarial relationship that I've talked about, that I want to avoid as an independent scrutineer. It was very distrustful. The national panel, as it was very distrustful of local boards, and inherent position would be to say, go to serious case review, almost implicitly, because they didn't necessarily trust boards to be transparent about things, which I think was regrettable. It cast a long shadow over the relation to boards and the national panel as was. The new national panel in comparison is allowing partnerships to be more creative in how they go about doing reviews, and is taking a far more collegiate view in supporting partnerships in establishing the way they work and in making sure that recommendations from rapid reviews get into practice. Just one additional piece of information about the new national panel. They have within GIFT the opportunity to commission national reviews. So they see all the rapid reviews that come through from partnerships like Somerset, and if they see developing themes, so for example, youth violence with respect to knives, they can commission a national review to draw those threads together, which would be taken forward on the sort of more analytical, more academic, more thorough basis that serious case reviews used to be. So rather than commissioning a serious case review almost as a default in every circumstance, but it's taking 3 years to do, now the national panel have this new national review that they can commission if they feel there's a joined up need to do that across the country. Okay, so I've given you a picture about rapid reviews, and I did say that in exceptional circumstances where a rapid review has not been sufficient to bottom what's happened in a particular circumstances, more detailed reviews can be commissioned locally. There's a couple of those going forward in Somerset in particularly complex circumstances, so they'll be in the public domain in due course. But like rapid reviews, there's now a very strict time frame for the more detailed reviews that partnerships can commission, so that there's no possibility that these things can drag on over multiple years and not be of great use at the point that they're published. The last thing just to put into your minds about these new, more detailed reviews is where serious case reviews, partnerships employed independent chairs and independent authors to look at each serious case review, an extremely expensive thing to do because these people were very costly and usually charged on a per diem basis. Now, with a tighter timescale, we appoint an independent author. That person takes the whole process forward, working with a subgroup, working to the executive and through the business unit headed up by Caroline. So that gives you a really quick overview of how that relationship is working. It's just coming up on 11:17, and it's my view that I'm going to stop my presentation at about 11:20. I haven't been asking whether there are questions, but I did encourage you at the outset to put your hand up if there were. So there will be a brief period subsequent to 11:20 for any discussion or any questions that you don't feel you've had an opportunity to ask. So let me use the last couple of minutes just to give you a brief overview in the context of the pandemic around what my view is in general terms of how safeguarding is working in Somerset. Well, as I mentioned earlier on, I have made a contribution to the annual report which the exec put together. So the exec talk about what they've done, what their priorities are, how they've progressed them, and what the sort of demography, if you like, of safeguarding Somerset is. My contribution is to take an overview of all of that. I've been extraordinarily impressed so far in my time in Somerset with the huge professional and personal commitment that I've seen from safeguarding practitioners across the partnership. So my background's in social work. That doesn't matter in this circumstance. I've seen some great social work, but I've also seen great nursing, great teaching, great policing. And I've also seen a wish for the joined up view. Mike talked about the fact that he feels his view as a senior police officer is being listened to and taken into account. I've also seen and heard a wish from individual practitioners around the county for their perspective, their experience, their view of safeguarding to be also taken into account. So I suppose I would encourage you to see our partnership as a relatively new endeavour, to give it a little bit of time to get its feet under the table of safeguarding. It can only be as good as the information that we get, and it can only take views from practitioners and others into account if you make those views known. So I suppose what I'm looking for, what I would hope for, based on the real quality of the safeguarding professionals that I've met with so far, is communicate what you're thinking up through your agencies in the same way that I would expect the recommendations from rapid reviews to be cascaded down to you as frontline workers or frontline managers. It's a reasonable expectation, I think. I think it's a professional expectation that you, as people at the chalk face of safeguarding, talk to your managers, ask your manager to cascade up to the exec and to me if necessary, your concerns and even circumstances where you think really, really good work is being done. Because this isn't just about sorting out things that aren't working perfectly, it's about evidencing with some data sometimes where we're doing a really good job. So my view of Somerset in general terms is the execs come together very well. It sends an extremely powerful message, I think, across the partnership that is chaired by Mike, it's chaired by a police officer. It shows in the most obvious of ways, perhaps, that this is a new type of relationship where police and health are just as engaged and their views are just as important as these from Director of Children's Services and from social workers. I'm impressed with the degree to which Somerset has engaged directly with young people, although I want to know more about how that works and how representative that is of all children across the county. And one of the real strengths in Somerset that haven't been lost in this changeover from board to partnership is an extremely capable safeguarding business unit, which is doing brilliant stuff in terms of training, in terms of data, and in terms of organising events like this forum to make sure that we tell you what we're doing, we listen carefully to what you're thinking. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks again for everyone's time.